So before we begin, let's just take a moment to refresh our motivation. We won't do a full meditation now, but let's go back to that place of understanding that all of our actions can have incredible results if we unite them with this motivation of bodhicitta. As Lama Yeshe says, one of the most painful things about samsara is that we can't help beings to the extent that we would like to. We see them in their pain and their suffering, but we feel incapable of doing what really needs to be done to help them. And the answer to that, he says, is bodhicitta. Bodhicitta is what will allow us, by strengthening it continually, trying to be in that mind, have all of our actions be driven by that mind. It allows us to actually attain the state of complete enlightenment. It allows us to be the most capable that we can be, fulfill our potential completely to benefit others in that state of Buddhahood. So just refresh that motivation so that all that we do this afternoon becomes the cause for attaining that state of perfect enlightenment and being able then to bring all sentient beings to that same state of Buddhahood. Okay. So I think this is where I left off. Yeah, we were talking about gratitude and forgiveness. And then this might be somewhat obvious. So many of these heart qualities, forgiveness, gratitude, and so on, they really do, have the ability to connect us to others, to make us feel that, our hearts are open to them, connecting with them. So there's another little quote here from Brother David, who says that when we are grateful, you are not fearful. When you are not fearful, you are not violent. When you are grateful, you act out of a sense of enough and not out of a sense of scarcity, and you are willing to share. So there's a kind of, again, out of gratitude can come so many of these other kind of human qualities that allow us to be genuinely connecting with others, willing to share with them, not being harmful to them, so. And then it continues, he says, if you are grateful, you are enjoying the differences between people and respectful to all people. A grateful world is a world of joyful people. Grateful people are joyful people. A grateful world is a happy world. So again, Brother David is, another example of just someone who has found the value of gratitude in our lives, who really can speak to that and the benefits from living in a space of gratitude. So there's one more slide on this idea of how gratitude connects us. Gratitude connects us all. When we are grateful for a meal, such as what we just had at lunch, we can be grateful for the food that we are eating and for all of those who have made the meal possible, the farmers, the grocers, and the cooks. And we could include, all the little creatures that are involved in the meals that we eat. That, if you have an almond, for example, you can be grateful for all the bees that are involved in cross-pollinating the almond flowers, or same goes for fruit, a lot of different things. So a lot of beings are involved in the things that we have, and it's a nice quality to have, to think about all of the beings involved in anything that we use. Was mentioning about being on the road and being grateful for all the other drivers on the road, because they don't make a road for just one person. They make it for many people to drive. But, we can also be grateful for certainly everybody who contributed to having a road there. It's not an easy process to put a road somewhere. The freeways we just take for granted and think that, they're just there for us to use. But there were many, many beings involved in producing all of these things that we use in our lives. So again, and the idea once more that helps us to connect to others, because we can't say that any particular person hasn't played a role in our welfare. I mean, there are many people who have. And even if he might seem at times to be quite indirect, nonetheless, we can certainly say that we're benefiting from those beings by their efforts, whatever they are, even if they are quite indirect to our own welfare. Then the last topic that we're going to look at, which is kind of an interesting one in the book, they talk a bit about kind of what we call a negative bias. And he says, scientists have long known that our brains have evolved with a negative bias. It was no doubt advantageous for our survival to focus on what was wrong or dangerous. So this is a bit of what we were talking about earlier, that kind of reptilian brain, or that side of us that will focus on where we're in danger. And if there's danger there, then we kind of tend to go to a negative mind, a mind that will lash out at the things that are in the way of our well-being. And so gratitude, he says, cuts across this default mode of the mind. It allows us to see what is good and right, and not just what is bad and wrong. Allows us to be grateful for all the good things that we do have in our lives. So then continuing, he says, perhaps because of this bias, people are often skeptical of gratitude and wonder if it is a naive point of view or will lead to complacency or even injustice. If we are grateful for what is, will we be less likely to work for what still needs to be done? And I guess this is a challenge to our gratitude, to make sure that, we don't become somewhat complacent. But nonetheless, I think if we really extend what gratitude means, there's really not that much room for complacency. We have to be grateful for whatever things we have in our lives, and not think that we just should take it for granted again, or feel like we're at some plateau of having everything that we want, and therefore we don't need to pay attention to the causes for that. Again, one of the biggest principles in Buddhism that we are always trying to follow is the idea of causality, that things arise on the basis of the causes and conditions that we create. So the question arises in the book of Joy. It says, if the Dalai Lama is able to find things in his exile that he's grateful for, will he be less willing to stand up to the Chinese occupation of Tibet? And again, he's just posing the question that does gratitude lead to some complacency? And I guess it's worth talking about this a little bit. Again, this is the last topic we'll look at in regard to gratitude, that sixth pillar of gratitude, these 8 pillars. So then he mentions UC Davis. Professor Robert Emmons has been studying gratitude for over a decade. So it's interesting when you read some of these books and you kind of get an idea for how much research goes on in, you guys have Stanford not too far from here, where they've done a lot of research on compassion and kind of the role of compassion in human community and the importance of that. So he's done a lot of research on gratitude. In one study with his colleagues Michael McCullough and Joanne Tsang, they found grateful people do not seem to ignore or deny the negative aspects of life. They simply choose to appreciate what is positive as well. So the answer to that question of whether, does gratitude cause us to be complacent or to ignore the faults that are going on, and we might fear that in our society. Certainly, we can say that a lot of inaction sometimes is sprung by people simply holding on to what is going well for them and ignoring the things that are going wrong in the world. But someone who's truly grateful will actually have an openness to both sides of it. They will see the good things in life, certainly, because gratitude allows you to do that, to have that appreciation for what is right, but it also allows you to continue to address on the things that need to be corrected. And of course, it can't be practiced, kind of exclusive of many other human qualities, some of which we're going to be exploring in the last 2 pillars of compassion and generosity. But gratitude in and of itself isn't going to be blind to the things that are wrong in life. So people with a strong disposition toward gratitude have the capacity to be empathetic and to take the perspective of others. They're rated as more generous and more helpful by people in their social networks. They are also more likely to have developed or to have helped someone with a personal problem or to have offered emotional support to others. So again, I think that we can see that there's many positive benefits to gratitude, to having this in our life, and some of them extend out into our social circles. When we're grateful, then that comes through in our actions and the way that we relate to others. We become more generous, we become kinder. So, I'm not going to spend tons of time on this. These slides, I think, are pretty self-explanatory. But I did want to share, as I've been doing, a number of passages from the Book of Joy, since it is such a good resource from these 2 teachers, His Holiness and the Archbishop Desmond Tutu. So it seems gratitude is motivating, not demotivating. Grateful people report more positive emotions, more vitality and optimism, and greater life satisfaction, as well as lower levels of stress and depression. And I won't go into, he goes on to tell all about the physical effects of gratitude. And there's no side effects as far as I know. It's not like you have to worry about all these, this whole list of everything going wrong when you're grateful. So gratitude and most of these other positive emotions really just have an upside. Maybe I'll skip over a few of these. Oh, this is kind of an interesting one. Smiling is contagious, stimulating unconscious smiling in others, which in turn spreads the positive effects. Did the Dalai Lama and the Archbishop smile because they were happy, or were they happy because they smiled? It sounded like a Zen koan. Both were true. So we see that it becomes a bit circular, that our happiness, our joy, this is why this is being talked about as one of the pillars of joy, that it increases as we practice gratitude, that this actually contributes to our well-being. And then our well-being, our happiness, does contribute to being more grateful. It is a bit circular, but it nonetheless makes complete sense. Nonetheless, I think we can go back to that quote that was shared earlier from Brother David, where he essentially said it is not happiness that makes us grateful, it is gratefulness that makes us happy. So the main contributing factor to our being able to be happy and content, to be joyful, is that we are grateful. It's a bit tying back to yesterday. I mentioned one of the perspectives that I think we can also admit is beneficial, because perspective was the first of these 8 pillars, is a more optimistic perspective rather than a pessimistic. That old phrase of the glass half empty versus half full. But if we're looking at life that way, continually through a lens of gratitude for what we have, not seeing the deficiencies as the main thing we focus on, again, it's not that we're blind to the deficiencies, but we really relish and cherish the things that we do have that are going well for us, that are in this world. Just every day waking up, as His Holiness said, with an acknowledgement of the preciousness of this life. And we're living in a relatively good condition within this human existence. Many human beings on this planet don't have the conditions we have. So while we have them, best to be very grateful for them. So concluding thoughts on gratitude. We're going to wrap this topic up so we can spend the rest of this afternoon on the last 2 of the 8 pillars. Impermanence, the Dalai Lama reminds us, is the nature of life. All things are slipping away, and there's a real danger of wasting our precious human life. Gratitude helps us catalog, celebrate, and rejoice in each day, in each moment, before they slip through the vanishing hourglass of experience. So, this is a common theme with His Holiness, as it is in Tibetan Buddhism, is to really recognize the preciousness of this life. The first teaching we usually get after that is, and this life is going to end. It's the reality of impermanence. And it's not to make us all depressed, it's to help us to make use of this. I think I used the example, I may have used that here, it's a mundane example, but if you were to say, I'm going to spend a week in Paris, and then you get to your hotel in Paris, and all you can do is sit in your room and fret about the fact that the final day of your vacation is going to come. Oh, it's only 6 days away now. Oh, poor me. The next day, oh my God, it's only 5 days away. And you never go out of your room to see Paris. So it's a mundane example, but in our human life, it's similar. If we sit there and we just fret over our death and get worried about our death, that's not the point. The point is to use that life well then, to get out of your room, to do the things that need to be done, because there is an acknowledgement that it will come to an end. Of course, with the vacation idea, you kind of have a bit of a, not quite guarantee, but an understanding you're going to go in a week. With death, we never know when we're going to go. That's, of course, the tricky part of it. And that may be even the more frightening side of it. Not that we have to die, but that we don't know when death will come. So if we're grateful in the moment, if we're grateful now, if we practice all of these 8 pillars now, then we've used this life well. Then we've actually done something meaningful and purposeful with this life. Otherwise, get to our deathbed and perhaps have lots of regrets on not having used this life to at least do something, to increase our positive qualities, to negate those that are not so beneficial. So then in the book, Douglas Abrams says perhaps it was no surprise to Sonia, and I don't know quite how to pronounce her name, Lubomirsky, that gratitude is a factor that seems to influence happiness, along with our ability to reframe negative events into positive ones. And I looked up who she was. She's a professor of psychology at UC Riverside. She's written a few books on happiness. So again, her comment that gratitude is a factor that seems to influence our happiness, along with this ability to reframe negative events into positive ones, which we keep coming across as we go through these teachings. This is one of the biggest ways that we can use anything that we meet into the path. Take it into the path, make it into something positive. Very rich part of this Buddhist tradition, particularly in Tibetan Buddhism. So the final factor that Sonia found, was our ability to be kind and generous towards others. And this is actually a big factor in our happiness as well, is when we are able to extend ourselves with this generous mentality, giving of ourselves, giving the things we possess, giving our time, our attention to others, which is where we're going to go next. And as it says there, the Archbishop and the Dalai Lama saw this generous quality towards others, as well as kindness and compassion, as two separate but related pillars, the remaining ones that we have for this afternoon, which are compassion and generosity. So these are the two topics we're going to mostly focus on next. When we recognize all that we have been given, it is our natural response to want to care for and give to others. And it does make sense, if we're really grateful for our own blessings, for all the things we have in our lives, then there's a fullness to our being, and we're not feeling so deficient and wanting more. We're recognizing the abundance we have and the ability to share that with others. So before we leave this topic of gratitude, though, I wanted to repeat the instructions that I mentioned the other night on my talk on gratitude, because I've had the chance to speak about gratitude twice here, once as a full session, and this is part of this 8 pillars. Is this wonderful practice from Brother David, who I've referred to here and there, the Benedictine monk who used to live down the way in Big Sur area at the Benedictine monastery there. He has this very kind of clever way of remembering this technique of stop, look, and go, kind of what your parents would tell you to do when you got to an intersection, right? So you didn't get hit by a bicycle or a car. Stop, look both ways and then go. So this is a little different. His first step of stop is taking a moment to be still. As I mentioned the other night, we have very busy lives. And even just to have the awareness to do that on occasion can be challenging, but an important thing to say, okay, I'm not going to keep moving forward with all of my agenda for the day. I'm going to stop for a moment to be still. Look, be curious about your own experience in this moment, which, as Brother David says, is unlike any other. Every single moment is different. Just right now we have several moments just passing us by. Every one of them is different, unlike any other. Some similarities, but nonetheless, every one unique. So kind of be curious about that. Kind of look at what's going on. And it can mean, just paying attention to the physical environment that we're in, to the people that we're with, and so on. And then the idea of go is that you don't just sit with that gratitude of what you have there that is this looking part of it. You act on the insight that comes from asking what this moment offers you and others. What's the potential we have in that moment that we can make something more of? We can find a way to share that, find a way to live from that. So it's not going to look identical every time you do this stop, look, go exercise. Might be called upon, say you're on your lunch break and you're sitting in a park and you're just eating your lunch, and then you do this, you stop, you say, okay, I'm just going to stop the eating and everything else, and I'm just going to be here and be present. And then you look, you sit and you just observe what's going on in the park around you, what people are there, what they're doing, the gratitude for the sun, for the park itself, for the people who are, in your presence. And maybe act on that insight that might come from that is just a genuine desire to send out loving kindness to them, for example, or to really wish them well, to really want all beings to have that kind of comfort, safety, security. Again, just an example, but I think this is a powerful practice that's very easy to remember. So my practice suggestions, which are on the sheet that you all have on that second side, the practice suggestions for gratitude are to sit quietly for a few minutes each day. This actually comes from the Book of Joy, the book that we're using for this course this weekend. And just to sit quietly, recalling 3 things from your day for which you're grateful. And he suggests putting them down in what you might call a gratitude journal, which, you don't have to go out and buy a book, a blank book or something to do that. You can do whatever works for you. And you don't even necessarily need to write them down. In my experience, you can certainly just recall them as enough to bring to mind 3 things that you're grateful for throughout your day. And sometimes it can be interesting to challenge that. We like to go to the nice stuff, oh, I'm so grateful that somebody gave me flowers. I'm so grateful that somebody did this for me. But think also about extending that gratitude to think about some of the more difficult things that we discussed a little this morning, having gratitude for the person who pushes your buttons, because they're a wonderful opportunity for you to practice patience, to try to look at where you're stuck, to see how you can open your heart in those situations. Or we become grateful for the problems that we have in our lives. That idea of like Venerable Rabina telling me congratulations when, I smashed my face on. There are times we can use those difficult situations, if we're really attentive to it, as very powerful parts of our practice. So we can have a gratitude for those even. So this is, this journal idea is, don't make it into too much of a just, Sound of Music kind of thing, everything wonderful, rainbows and kittens and whatever, all the stuff that she says, all my favorite things, Don't go always there about just having gratitude for those what are quite understandably good things in your life. Try to have gratitude even for the difficult things in your life. Because once more, they're great teachers. They really can help us on our path. And then if you can, try using the stop, look, go practice to be more mindful of gratitude in your daily life. And there's other practices out there. I mentioned the other night that in that movie, The Secret, I think it was, this one man had a gratitude stone that he kept in his pocket or around his neck or something. And every time that he would grab for it or reach in his pocket, he would remember something to be grateful for. I mean, any way of kind of inducing this mindfulness of gratitude, I think, is really important. But as I said with the one up above, don't always think in terms of, oh, I'm so grateful for all the delicious food I have and all the wonderful things. Be also grateful for those things that are difficult. So any final questions on gratitude or comments on gratitude? It's obviously an important quality to have in our lives, not to always be looking at the negative sides of things, and even if things are negative, to be able to find some benefit in the midst of that. So we're going to go on to the 7th pillar then, and this is a big topic as well, compassion. And as I mentioned, I try to find a little cartoon for some of the slides I show. For each of these pillars, I tried to find one, and when I put in a search for compassion, I got this one that was kind of interesting, empathy and compassion. These two are related. They're not identical, but the picture that's there, if you can't see it, there's a homeless person who's behind a mirror. That's what's sitting on the curb there. And he has his hat out in front. And his hand is extended, but he's got that mirror that is showing the person who's potentially going to give him money himself. So that's a part of what we mean by empathy, right? Is the ability to see oneself in others, to see the other person's condition, to put oneself in someone else's shoes. And so this is a good part of compassion. And it's quite interesting. Even in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, we talk a lot about compassion and a lot about loving kindness, but we frequently don't talk about empathy. Empathy isn't the topic for this particular pillar, but I think it's worth pointing out that we perhaps do need to be attentive to training ourselves in being empathic. Not everybody is naturally, empathetic of what's going on with others. And there's even some teachings that this course I mentioned previously that I facilitate called The Art of Fulfillment. There's 3 sessions of it where we work with developing what's called balanced empathy. In essence, what we mean by balanced empathy is kind of the head and the heart sort of components of it. That we need to have our hearts wide open to others, but that in and of itself could be really one-sided. It's out of balance because it's not recognizing that we have to be attentive to what the person's particular situation is and what needs to be done. That's more the kind of head part of it. So these two components of empathy are really important to balance out. Some people are really good about the heart stuff and just are like weeping at everything they see, but they're incapable of acting upon it because they can't really, say, well, what is it that this person really needs at this time? What is the wisest response to the suffering I see before me? And some people are really good at kind of fixing this stuff and making sure things are dealt with, but their heart's not in it. So we have to have both components. So, on the topic of compassion, I'll share a few slides to introduce this topic. Once more, this is from the chapter on compassion in the Book of Joy. This is the Dalai Lama speaking, or something he said earlier in the week. Too much self-centered thinking is the source of suffering. A compassionate concern for others' well-being is the source of happiness. This is actually a paraphrasing of, one of the verses from Master Shantideva again. Master Shantideva, this great 8th century Indian Buddhist master who the Dalai Lama quotes him frequently. He wrote a book called A Guide to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life. There's actually, I see it right now, the Beautiful Way of Life, this red book that's there towards the front, right next to The Art of Happiness by His Holiness. That's kind of an interesting book that Venerable Rene, who's coming here later this year, right, I think in October, he's put together based on his meditation on this text. And it's not a translation of the text, it's more like the sentiment of each of the verses. But His Holiness quotes the Master Shantideva a lot because he was one of the most profound practitioners of our tradition, of this Mahayana tradition, and really in touch with this level of compassion. And the verse that he has that this is based on, this quote that His Holiness is giving, is, all the suffering there is in the world arises from wanting happiness for oneself alone. All the happiness there is in the world arises from wanting happiness for others. And so this is, again, something that we're not taught in school, right? This isn't how we operate in terms of, indoctrinating people into this thinking. And it seems somewhat paradoxical, because we tend to think that if I stay focused on me, myself, and I, from the time I get up till the time I go to bed, that I'm going to get what I want. This is what we buy into almost every day of our lives. This is called the self-centered attitude, or sometimes it's called self-cherishing. But it's not just the simple thought of wanting happiness for oneself and not wanting not to suffer. It's that thought generally together with the thought of, and I'm going to be negligent of the needs of others. It's like I'm going to be focused on me, myself, and I, thinking my welfare is the most important. I'm the center of the universe. As I mentioned the other night, I'm the one on the stage and everybody else is there to applaud me or do whatever, and that's why I get annoyed when people don't applaud for me or throw tomatoes at me or whatever. The idea is that we tend to see it from a point of view of my needs being most important. And that's what causes us to think that we deserve that parking spot, and there should be nobody else out on the road when we're in a hurry, and the things that we want or need at the store better be there, or we're really upset. It's all about me. It's all about my needs. And as I said, we're frequently negligent of the welfare of others when we're looking at things from that vantage point. So His Holiness, in reciting or reiterating this idea that comes from Master Shantideva, which comes from the Buddha, is that if we reverse that attitude, if we actually have compassion and love and concern for others, if we actually embrace the welfare of others as what's most important, that actually becomes the source of happiness. The source of happiness for others because we are attentive to their needs and helping them, but the source of happiness for ourselves because the acts we engage in from a cherishing others' point of view are always going to be more beneficial. Karmically, they're going to bring about happiness. So I tend to look at it sometimes if we did a little chart and we said, okay, if we continue to follow self-centered thinking, it's a source of suffering for both ourselves and others. So it's like a lose-lose situation. We lose because we don't produce the causes for our own well-being. Instead, we very selfishly go about trying to get what we want. And others lose because we're not attentive to what they need. We're missing the opportunity to be a benefit to them. But if we follow the mind that has compassionate concern for others' well-being, that is cherishing others, it's win-win. It's win because we ourselves will have all the causes created for our own well-being. This is why His Holiness, you'll see this in a slide coming up, I mentioned it yesterday, this is why His Holiness calls this being wisely selfish. How we actually have our needs met is by focusing on the needs of others. How we are actually able to be at our deepest level of happiness is by being concerned about their well-being. And others benefit too, because obviously we are tending to them, we are caring for them, we're at their bedside when they need help, we are, paying attention to them when they're homeless and on the street, whatever. All of these things that we do benefit others and benefit ourselves. So it's very clear. It's a lose-lose situation if we continue doing what we're doing. It's a win-win if we do the opposite. And we all have cherishing others to some degree. I'm not making it sound like, I shouldn't be making it sound like we're totally self-centered every minute of the day, because we know we aren't. Our hearts open up very quickly, particularly to people who we already have a heart connection with. And that's the limitations of our compassion, is that we find it hard to extend compassion beyond that. Occasionally we can, and many of us might be quite trained in being compassionate to where we can easily extend it beyond that circle of people who are very close to us. But that, in and of itself, that every one of us has the ability to at least be compassionate to those that we're quite close to, shows that we have the potential to be compassionate. We just need to extend the circle of that, need to get further and further out. Why we tend to be quite okay with being compassionate and concerned about those people who are in our close circle is because there's a bit of self-interest in that too, for many of us. We take care of them so that they can take care of us. Well, again, we have to be able to extend beyond that and see that our tending to the needs of others, our compassion and concern for others, should be for all beings. Regardless, whether they're the president or whether they're, the next door neighbor or whether they're the bug crawling on the floor or whatever the case might be. So the Dalai Lama, had said this earlier in the week in their discussions in Dharamsala when these discussions took place that this book is based on. He was now rubbing his hands together in thought as he returned to the topic of compassion. So this is His Holiness talking. He says, on this planet, over the last 3,000 years, different religious traditions developed, and all these traditions carry the same message, the message of love and compassion. So the purpose of all these different traditions is to promote and strengthen the value of love and compassion. So, different medicine, but same aim, to cure our pain, our illness. As we mentioned, even scientists now say that basic human nature is compassionate. And this is what I was mentioning earlier as well, I think yesterday, when we talk about kind of how our fundamental nature is good. It may not be what we get from society at large, where everyone's mistrusted. We have that in our judicial system, right, that you're innocent until proven guilty, but it seems to be more like the opposite frequently. Everyone's guilty until they prove that they're innocent. You kind of live in a world where there's lots of suspicion, and we think the worst of somebody till they prove us otherwise. But our fundamental nature, our basic nature, is compassionate, is love, is joy, is all these positive things, if we're able to really get in touch with that. And I would say, again, we don't need to go far to prove that. When we've been compassionate with others, and every one of us has done that again, whatever degree our compassion goes, we know those experiences. We really do feel like we're at our best in those moments, right? We feel like we're more genuinely in touch with who we are. Does anyone want to speak to that from your own experience? It just does, from my experience. I feel like when I'm in that place, when I lived in San Francisco in the 80s and 90s, I was very involved around the HIV epidemic, and one of the things I chose to do eventually was to do hospice work, where you're with people in their last weeks, days, could be hours, And I can say that it was some of the hardest work I ever did, but it was some of the richest, because I was able to, when I went there, kind of put myself out of the picture and be with somebody in the space of seeing what it was they really needed. Now, I have to admit, I did have a bit of an agenda when I would come in the door, because I was a massage volunteer. So I was trained by this wonderful woman who's still a good friend of mine named Irene Smith, who started an organization. She was one of the first people to go into this field of providing touch work, body work for people in life-threatening situations, AIDS, cancer, what have you. And she still to this day trains people to do this work. And so I trained with her, and so my job was to go to the residential hospice and to offer massage. But there was one day I came in and nobody wanted massage. So I'm like, okay, well, I'm here. I'm going to be here for 3 hours. Was there something I can do? And of course, this kind of freaked me out at the moment, because I liked having an agenda. I liked coming in and saying, I'm the massage therapist, volunteer massage therapist. Can I, rub your feet or whatever? So there was one gentleman who actually was, as it turned out, only about a day from his death. And I sat with him. They wanted me just to sit with him and be kind of there, to have a presence in the room. And it was the most powerful, 45 minutes I spent with anybody. I just sat there with him. And I did at one point then, I couldn't avoid some touch. I went and grabbed his hand, gently, and just held his hand. And it was just really powerful to be with somebody in that space of just what I could do at the moment. I couldn't fix anything for him, obviously. He didn't want any massage, but it was just the presence with him. And what touched me, the conclusion to the story, was that his mother came to visit him, and she came into the room, and I was just sitting there gently holding his hand. And he stirred from his sleep, and he looked up at his mom, and he said, "Mom, you have to come over here and do this. This is the most wonderful thing." And she just comes over there, and all I do is put her hand into his hand and left. And it was just so powerful. But, anyway, I'm giving maybe a bit of a plug for my friend Irene and her work. I think that, sometimes we have to find our avenues of how we can extend ourselves to others. Touch work is a very powerful way to do that. But my point was that for me, that experience was one of the richest experiences I've had in my life. I still recall it to this day, and how I felt in being there and being able to connect the two of them in a space of compassion with each other. And as I said, he died the next day. But our basic human nature is compassionate. I think we feel most alive when we're in that space of compassion, when we are able to be with others in their pain, in their suffering. So, anyway, both the Archbishop and Dalai Lama had emphasized that this compassionate concern for others is instinctual, and that we are hardwired to connect and to care. However, as the Archbishop explained earlier in the week, it takes time. We are growing and learning how to be compassionate, how to be caring, how to be human. So this is something admittedly that we have. This is kind of once more the paradox we had at the beginning. We could say that joy is our essential nature, compassion is our essential nature, but it still means we have work to do. It still means that we have the job of cultivating these things. So while compassion is most resonant with our deepest sense of being, it's also something we have to tend to and practice compassion, because we have a lot of barriers to compassion. This is going to be one of the topics we'll look at today. So the Buddha supposedly said, "What is that one thing which when you possess it, you have all other virtues? It is compassion." So by the way, those of you who came in for this afternoon know that I'm happy if you give me your email address to supply you with the PDF file of all of these slides, if you don't feel like writing everything down, but you're certainly welcome to take notes as well. So after, in the next day or so, I'll send that out to everybody on the list. So compassion is really important. So he says it is worth taking a moment to think about what compassion really means, since it is often misunderstood. One book that some of you in the room may have read by Thupten Jinpa, who we've mentioned a number of times. He's His Holiness's translator, but as I mentioned, he's also quite involved in this cultivating compassion training in Stanford. He's got a book that is the essence of a lot of that training, A Fearless Heart, how the courage to be compassionate can transform our lives. He says compassion is a sense of concern that arises when we are confronted with another's suffering, and feel motivated to see that suffering relieved. This is maybe adding a bit more of even just the Mahayana perspective, is that we are not just seeing it and moved by it, which is a bit of that empathy that we can say, oh, I'm so sorry that that is happening to that person. But we have to additionally have that kind of motivation to want that suffering to stop. For that, not because we're uncomfortable with it, but because we don't want that being to experience that. Sometimes I point out that the decisions we make around our pets, for example, at their end of life, when they're experiencing getting close to dying or experiencing great illness, sometimes our decision has more of a concern about our own experience of their suffering versus the suffering of that being. So why we feel motivated to see the suffering relieved isn't because we don't want to see it anymore. We want it out of our sphere of experience. Ideally, it should be because we don't want that being to suffer anymore. So if you do decide to euthanize your pet, that's just an aside, but make sure that the motivation as much as possible is because you don't want that being to suffer. Not that you're tired of all the suffering being around you and not, I don't know. We sometimes even make those sorts of assessments when we're dealing with people who are dying and not necessarily wanting to be confronted with that. But we have to have mostly the perspective of the being who's suffering. That's the empathy again, that identification of putting ourselves in their shoes and seeing what it must be like for them to be in that space of suffering and wanting them to not have that any longer. That's what makes it really genuine compassion. So then he adds, this is Thupten Jinpa still speaking, compassion is what connects the feeling of empathy to acts of kindness, generosity, and other expressions of altruistic tendencies. Because compassion should be active. Sometimes we even use the term courageous compassion, the idea that we're not just going to kind of sit on our couch and cry about the suffering of the world. We're going to be moved by that suffering of the world to act appropriately, to commit acts of kindness and generosity, other ways that we are altruistic and involved in the welfare of others. So this was a curious thing from the book that I didn't know. I don't know Hebrew. I'm not familiar with the Hebrew language, with the biblical Hebrew word for compassion, and I'm probably horribly mispronouncing it, but rachamim comes from the root word for womb, rachem. And the Dalai Lama often says that it is from our mother's nurturing that we learn compassion. He also said that his mother was his first teacher of compassion. So it's kind of interesting that in that language they very much tie compassion to the womb. And this is an amazing kind of source of our compassion is the role that our mothers particularly play in our development and protecting us and so on out of their compassion. The first teachers we have of compassion frequently. So in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, we often use our mothers as an archetype for how we look at all sentient beings, to try to see them through the lens of that role that our mothers play in this life and translating that for every being. Seeing them as our mother sentient beings, this is sometimes a phrase we use. So it is from being nurtured and in turn nurturing our own children that we discover the nature of compassion. Compassion is in many ways expanding this maternal instinct that was so pivotal to the survival of our species. Now, again, it doesn't mean that if you're male and you haven't played that role of being a mother in this life, or if you as a woman haven't played that role of being a mother, that somehow you're missing out on something. We can model that and see that played out in the role that a mother plays in particular for their offspring in the human species as well as other species. But we can see that it's something that we too can develop. We don't need to have that experience necessarily, but we all are children. We all have parents who have hopefully demonstrated some of that for us. So whether or not we've been in that role, we know what this looks like. And if we didn't experience it directly, well, it's unfortunate, but we can see it in our world. Many people who embody those qualities of, being compassionate, caring mothers. So I found it kind of interesting. This brought back to me when I first went through this book, a quote that I copied down when I was watching a PBS special that was on nature. I think it was called Animal Reunions or something. It was about these people who had been with animals in their younger years and played the role of mother for them. And then after the animals had been released into the wild, they were reunited with them. You've seen some of these videos, right, of like the lion going up, and you think, oh my God, he's going to attack this guy, but he's up there to like lick his face and all this, because there's a strong bond that is created even when somebody just plays the role of mother, isn't their natural mother. But this Mark Beckhoff, some of you may have heard of him. He's done a lot around animal behavior and animal emotions. To try to inform the world of this. And he was interviewed as part of this show on Nature, and he said the mother-infant relationship is one of the strongest and most highly evolved. And there are some people who actually believe that that is the root of all the bonding and compassion and empathy that we see among animals. They really believe that it's basically born, if you will, in the mother-infant bond. Well, certainly we see that what His Holiness was saying is that this was born for him in the bond he had with his own mother. But it even seems that in the animal world, at least, I would say primarily maybe mammals, but even perhaps to some extent in other birds and I don't know about reptiles, hard to say, insects, who knows. But certainly in those animals that we frequently see, mammals and so on, we can see that there is something that's transmitted there, some compassion and empathy that is a part of that equation of a mother caring for its offspring, for the infants. So that's just a little introduction to compassion. Anyone have anything they want to share before we go down into the weeds of the presentation? Yes, what's your name, by the way?
Jessica.
Hi, Jessica. I'm Don.
Hi, Don. I taught in high school for independent studies for young teens, mother's program.
I see. Oh, wonderful.
And they were age maybe 15 to 17, and they were street kids. Oh. But when they would have their babies, they would just transform
Interesting.
into these compassionate, loving mothers who wanted the best for their children.
Wow. How wonderful. You get to witness that and be a part of that transformation. That's great. Yeah, I think something happens there, that again is... I don't know that experience, obviously, but I think that it's really very powerful. So it's good to see that even at such a young age, people can have a transformation occurring there. That's good. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah. Does any of the mothers in the room want to speak to any of this?
I've had that experience too.
As a mother, okay. Good. I mean, we certainly know that, mothers are renowned for saying they will do anything for their children, and there's those stories of like a child that gets underneath the wheel of a car and the mother's able to go out there, and even though it makes no sense, they're able to lift the car to get their child out from underneath it. That there's something that happens in the body chemistry that allows such a compassionate response to the suffering of their own children. And so again, that's where it starts. That's sort of the initial bond and the initial thing where we get that from another and perhaps even are able to express it to another, but then it moves from there. And the compassion shouldn't be just limited to offspring or to people who are in that immediate circle. It needs to advance out. Of course, that means we need to be able to feel connected to others. We need to see some concern for their well-being. If we don't, then, we're quite capable of just shutting it all off, not being empathetic, not being compassionate at all. So it's important to acknowledge this is where it starts, because it's a very powerful place to start, but keeps advancing on. These are great. Thanks for sharing that. So let's look at these 4 things that are talked about in the book. And again, I'm just going to put up a few quotes to get us into the discussion of these. The essential advice for cultivating compassion. I think this is important to talk about. They did at one point in their discussion, His Holiness and the Archbishop talk about the benefits of compassion, the obstacles to compassion. And then self-compassion is worth talking about here, because we are in a culture where we're not very good at this. We tend to be very hard on ourselves. So we'll talk about that a bit. So in terms of the essential advice for cultivating compassion, while we all carry what the Dalai Lama calls the seed of compassion from our own experience of being nurtured by others, that initial experience with our mother and so on, compassion too is actually a skill that can be cultivated. It is something that we can learn to develop and then use to extend our circle of concern beyond our immediate family to others. And it helps when one recognizes our shared humanity. When once more we get out of this feeling like, oh, my problems and my difficulties and all of this, and recognize that we're in the same boat as everyone else. It's not to diminish self-importance completely, but to acknowledge that we're operating from an elevated sense of self-importance. You do matter, absolutely. And this, every being matters, but you don't matter more than everyone else, So Douglas Abrams now said, and in the book he said, while everyone agrees that being compassionate is a worthy goal, it is hard for many people to understand or to put it into practice. The word compassion, as we have said, literally means suffering with. The Latin root cum is with, passion, to suffer with, to feel that with. So what would you say, Douglas Abrams asks, to the person who says, I have enough problems of my own. Why should I worry about being more compassionate and think about others who are suffering? I hear this occasionally in teachings. People saying, well, compassion's a nice idea, but thank you very much. I'm suffering. How do you expect me to be so concerned about everyone else when I've got a pretty full plate here? So, as we have discussed, the Dalai Lama began, we are social animals. Even for kings or queens or spiritual leaders, their survival depends on the rest of the community. So therefore, if you want a happy life and fewer problems, you have to develop a serious concern for the well-being of others. This once more is rooted in the concept that we've touched on a number of times over this weekend, which is interdependence. A big theme in Buddhism, that none of us are completely isolated from the rest of the world. We like to think that at times and think we're totally self-sufficient, but try just spending an hour not depending on anything that other people have been involved in creating. Whether it be the food that you eat or whether it be the clothes that you wear, the house that you live in, we see that everything around us has arisen through other people's actions, through other people's kindness. So our survival depends upon the rest of the community. Without all of that, we're stuck. So if you want to have fewer problems, if you want to have a happy life, the Dalai Lama says, then a serious concern for the welfare of others is called upon, because that is the source of our well-being and happiness. We can't just think that, we're just going to take care of myself and that's going to manage everything, because it's blind to the fact that what we have in our lives that brings us happiness, and of course this is all the way up to enlightenment, all of those levels of happiness depend upon others. We need others in our lives. We need other beings. As I was saying about the roads, when you're out on the road and you get in a traffic jam or all these people out on the road, you might want to get really angry at all the other drivers, but they didn't build the road for just you. They don't build it for just one driver. They build it for everyone to use. So we should be concerned about their well-being as well as our own, not just be solely caught up in, I'm going to be late for what I'm going to and all of my needs. Look around, see what everybody else is doing in their car. Extend them compassion, loving kindness. So this is where, once more, you may say your plate is full. You may say that you have your own problems. But the reality is that you need other people to resolve any of those. You need other people to change any sort of situations in your life. So I got a quote from the Dalai Lama that comes from another teaching that he did. And this isn't from the book of... Oh, this is from the Book of Joy. Oh, no, maybe it isn't. I may have that up there incorrectly. I think this is another quote that I found online. He says, and this is that phrase I mentioned earlier, my advice is that if you must be selfish, if you're going to be selfish in any way, be wisely selfish. Wise people serve others sincerely, putting the needs of others above their own. Ultimately, you will be happier. The kind of selfishness that provokes fighting, killing, stealing, using harsh words, forgetting other people's welfare, will only result in your own loss. That once more, it's a lose-lose situation if we only tend to ourselves. If we tend to others, it's win-win. Now, again, the situation I was explaining about feeling some deep joy or deep contentment in the space of my hospice volunteer work, that's one product of doing that. Not everybody has that immediate response to that kind of work, but there's long-term benefits from that too, that we have to not be blind to. And this is why yesterday we talked about long-term perspective, that things do have ramifications well beyond the moment, well beyond that hour or 45 minutes, that we are able to produce the causes for future happiness by our actions that are particularly other-directed. His Holiness's thing that emphasized frequently, his advice to people is do your best to benefit others, and if you can't benefit them, at least don't harm them. If we live our lives with that kind of a guide for our actions, so everything we do, we intend to try to benefit others. And if we can't benefit them in the moment, at least don't do things that harm them, that upset their minds or interfere with their physical well-being or whatever. So there are karmic ramifications of all those actions. Of course, this is the guiding principle of causality that is go back to frequently in all of the teachings I give. It seems like it comes up. This is the importance of why we have to have that conviction in karma, because when we engage in actions that are other-focused, frequently it may not feel that good. It may not feel that wonderful to say, okay, I'm going to set all of my plans aside. I'm going to do, something that is other-focused instead of nurturing myself in this kind of way that's very self-centered. Well, it won't feel necessarily that good in the moment. It won't feel like a wonderful volunteer experience. It may feel actually like you're going completely against the grain. But we have to have that conviction that those other-focused actions will result in happiness. That by our attending to others, being generous with our time, being kind to others in whatever way we can, that those have their positive impacts. And we may not see some of them till further down the road. And I'm talking here from like an individual point of view. Obviously, we know that the more kindness there is in the world, the kinder world we live in. So we're not denying that there's all these other peripheral effects, because any sort of stone we drop in the pond of the world, the ripples are created. The ripples do manage to go beyond our own little circle. But if we're thinking in terms of what I need, well, then the best way to attend to what I need is to attend to the needs of others. Because it's karmically the force through which we are able to create the causes for our future well-being, for our future happiness. Just look at the simple. We're going to talk about generosity as the last of these 8 pillars. The karma of generosity is that it creates resources in your life. So if you look around, and we just talked about gratitude before this, look around at all the things you have in your life that you're grateful for. You shouldn't be sitting there thinking, I'm grateful for this and it came from nowhere. You're grateful for this and it came from your own past actions of generosity, which depended upon others to practice that generosity towards. So we get kind of all of these in a circle. We can be grateful for that which we have done out of our compassion and concern for others that has now ripened into, our own seeing the fruits of our generosity. So if you have lots of resources in your life, or even just minimal resources in your life, anything you have in your life came through your past actions. I know it's very hard for us to get this because it doesn't come with like a little tag on it that says, oh, this came from my generosity 3 lifetimes ago when I gave, a morsel of bread to a bird or something. It doesn't have that explanatory note attached to it, so we can't know all the intricacies of our karma. They say until you're a Buddha, this being who has the awareness of all of these things, until you're in that state, you won't know the intricacy of karma. You won't be able to pick it all apart and say, oh, I'm experiencing this now because of 5 lifetimes ago or earlier in this life or whenever it was that I created that. But this is the mechanism by which things happen. Again, it's a Buddhist explanation of why things happen. That's how I frequently phrase what karma is all about. Other traditions will have another explanation about why things happen. I mentioned my mom and her thinking of, that there's a creator God behind what she experiences, and that God only gives her what she can manage in this idea. That's another perspective. Buddhist perspective is that the force of karma is the way that we have things in our life, the way that we experience things in our life. And it's more than just that immediate ripening into that. It influences so many things that we do. It influences the states of mind that we continually have, the habitual tendencies that we have. Karma is a pretty prevalent force in our lives. And we shouldn't have this idea of either I believe in it or not. As I mentioned the other night, I think it's better to think of it as a working hypothesis, because we can't prove it. I can't prove the law of karma to any of you. But if we take it as a working hypothesis and say, okay, I'm going to tend to my actions with the understanding that they do have ramifications, that the way that I behave now will have an effect on my future experience, and should also, of course, affect my immediate experience, but have that confidence that they will ripen into the things that are good for us and for others in our lives. And if I stop doing all the negative things, all the harmful stuff, which is the foundation of Buddhist thinking, is this idea of ahimsa, non-harmfulness. If I actually practice all of that, that I will not experience the unfavorable things. Now again, it's over time. This isn't to say that you immediately get that. John Lennon's instant karma isn't really, what taught in Buddhism. Instant karma. There was even one little cartoon that was kind of cruel in a way, but it was this little boy who was getting ready to shoot an arrow at a bird, but he had the arrow in the thing backwards, so he was like pulling the string away from him with the arrow towards him. And it said Billy's karma was not only instant, but it was also preemptive, keeping him from shooting the bird. But anyway, sorry, shouldn't be laughing. So go back to this idea of karma. Karma is an operative principle that is taught in Buddhism. When we sort of sign up for it, it's signing up for it with the understanding of this is the mechanism that I can use as a hypothesis for how I want to live my life. To think that if I continue to invest in other-oriented actions, positive actions where I'm benefiting others, being kind to them, generous to them, engaging in, acts that support their welfare, and I stop doing the things that harm them, stop killing them and stealing from them and all the other things that we do to beings in this world, then I'll start seeing some benefits over time. And hopefully I'll feel better in myself, right? Because we do tend to not like, we have a bit of a negative mind when we go to those other selfish tendencies, and we have a much more positive mind when we go to the other-oriented actions. So this is His Holiness' advice that he gives continually about being wisely selfish. So then the Archbishop chimes in. He says, I would say that one of the ways to show that compassion is something we want to become is the very fact that we admire compassionate people. You don't, very, very few of us, he says, admire a vengeful person. Why did they come to listen to the Dalai Lama? This is the Archbishop talking about his friend. It's very largely because of who he has become. They are attracted to him because of his spiritual stature, a stature that has been created by the fact of his caring for others, even in the midst of his own suffering, the suffering of being in exile. So we do see this, that we, tend to admire people who embody this quality of compassion, that we can actually, we're attracted to that. There's something that we find wonderful about that. As I said, we even find it in ourselves, that when we think about when we're at our best, I mentioned earlier about when you're at your worst, well, think about when you were at your best, when you were kind of feeling like, that's how I would like to be ideally all the time. It's usually in the space of some opening of our hearts with compassion to others. So, the benefits of compassion, I think we all know a lot of these, but I'm going to go through them nonetheless. I'll try to speed it up a little bit so we have plenty of time for generosity. The first one, it makes suffering more bearable. The Archbishop said, when you say I, as His Holiness pointed out, you are going to come a cropper. I never heard this phrase before. Come a cropper means, have everything go south. It's just going to not be good. But when you say, how can I help? Even in the midst of your deep anguish, it's got an alchemy that transforms your pain. We know these kinds of stories, and again, I cited a few things from Germany in the midst of the concentration camps and things, that some of the people who found that they were able to get in touch with their compassionate response to the suffering of others that were in the camps with them, helped them to transform that experience, helped them to, make it through, to feel like they were making the best use of that time. It may not take it away. In other words, your suffering may not go away. It's not like you're going to instantly have it removed in some sort of, again, karmic, instantaneous result. But it becomes, in a way, bearable, more than it was at the time when you were just saying, poor me, thinking only about yourself. So I think we know this too, that this first benefit is quite obvious, that if we are able to and I'm not talking about commiserating with others, I'm talking about where we genuinely do what we can to alleviate the suffering of others in the moment, that our own suffering becomes unbearable. There's even these extreme cases of it, right, where I remember hearing this one story of somebody, I think it was I don't know if it was in Iraq or Afghanistan, one of these recent, places where the United States is gone. And there was a man who went out to save some of his fellow soldiers from gunfire and what have you. And he was wounded in the midst of this, but he kept going and doing what he could to relieve these other people from this suffering situation. And he didn't even notice he was wounded until all of that was done. Like his own suffering became totally negligible in the face of him being other concerned. So I think we know that this has great power to make our own suffering much less, much more bearable. It also liberates from fear. His Holiness, in response to what the Archbishop had said, very right, thinking me, automatically brings fear, a sense of insecurity and distrust. That kind of person will never be a happy person. And at the end of that person's life, their neighbor will be happy that that person is gone, yes? Maybe we don't want to be that person that, all the neighbors have a party when you're gone. They never had a party when you were there and invited you. But this is true. People who don't have a compassionate connection to others are frequently living in a state of fear and distrust of others. And it's very sad to see when that's the case. His Holiness says, if you look after others, particularly those who are in need, then when you are passing through some difficulties, there are plenty of people you can ask for help. This is just kind of a practical thing around it, right? This tends to be the case. I'm not saying it's absolute, but it tends to be that if you've been somebody who's greatly cared for others, when you're in a situation of needing care and attention, others are there for you because it's reciprocal. People will frequently be happy to help where others have helped them. Then at the end, many people will feel that they have really lost a wonderful person. So it's just common sense, the Dalai Lama concluded, pointing to his forehead. So I think this is a very practical way that we can see that, it gets rid of that kind of fear, distrust, that disconnection to others. It actually creates those more healthy bonds to others, liberating from our fear. And then he goes on, and then I want to say, very passionate and wanting to convince the skeptics, look at Stalin's picture or Hitler's picture and compare it to the face of Mahatma Gandhi and also the face of this person, pointing to the Archbishop. So I have a little exercise in the next slide that you can do, and just take a look at these two faces and see if you see which one is more liberated from fear. I mean, it's pretty obvious, right? Poor Adolf there on the left, it's a very fearful face if you think about it and really examine what's going on with the eyes and the sternness to the mouth and everything. Whereas if you look at Gandhi's face, it's so much more at peace. There's no fear there. There's no mistrust of others. There's no insecurity. Remember how we talked about people who are coming from that place of insecurity are definitely in deep suffering. So anyway, a little experiment. So actually a few more slides to conclude this topic. He says, you can see that person who has all the power, but who lacks compassion, who only thinks about control, and maybe somebody comes to mind in our current world that fits the bill for that, has all the power, lacks compassion, only thinks about control, maybe not lacks compassion, but certainly has lower compassion. The Dalai Lama said as he ground one hand in the other, can never be happy. I think during the night they do not have sound sleep. They always have fear. Many dictators sleep in a different place every night because they're fearful of what may happen to them on the basis of that insecurity. So what creates that kind of fear is their own way of thinking, their own mind. Mahatma Gandhi's face was always smiling, and to some extent I think Nelson Mandela. Also, because he was not obsessed with power, millions of people remember him. If he had become a dictator, then nobody would have mourned his death. So that's my view, quite simple. So I think His Holiness is pointing out to these very kind of practical and obvious things to some extent. But this is a benefit that we too can have, that we can really be liberated from our own fear by being more compassionate, being more concerned about others. Another benefit, it brings joy and satisfaction. And so this is Douglas Abrams saying that he was really pushing these two teachers hard because he didn't want to leave the compassion in the lofty realms of saints and lamas. He says, I knew they were suggesting that it was a pillar of joy for the rest of us, for all of us. And I wanted to understand why it has been so hard for our modern culture to embrace. And admittedly, you might sit there and think, well, Don's up here saying that, compassion is kind of our deepest nature, and it's really, who we are, and it's really quite complementary, and it has all these amazing benefits. But why are people so uncompassionate? Why is the world so uncaring? So that same cynic might say, if compassion is so natural, and it's in many ways the ethical root of all religions, and for thousands of years people have been preaching and teaching compassion, then why is there such a lack of compassion in the world? So, the Archbishop says, our human nature has been distorted. I mean, we are actually quite remarkable creatures. And this is the Archbishop speaking to his tradition. He says, in our religion, I am created in the image of God. I am a God carrier. It's fantastic. I have to be growing in God-likeness, in caring for the other. I know that each time I have acted compassionately, I have experienced a joy in me that I find in nothing else. And even the cynic, he says, will have to admit that it is how we are wired. We're wired to be other-regarding. We shrivel if there is no other. It's really a glorious thing. When you say, I will care for only me in an extraordinary way, that me shrivels and gets smaller and smaller. It's kind of an interesting way of putting it. We like to think, if I focus on myself, that I'm going to actually make myself into something bigger. But his observation is that it actually makes it, very, very small. And once more, that's because of a lot of these other things we've talked about, the insecurity, the fear, all of that comes with that, because of our tightness around this self that we're so focused on. And he goes on, and in that state, you find satisfaction and joy increasingly elusive. Then you want to grab and try this and try that, but in the end, you don't find satisfaction. So, on the other hand, the physical benefits, this is mostly mental that we've been talking about here, the things that happen to us when we're in that compassionate space. This is also something that's pointed out frequently, and a lot of these we've touched on some of the other ones in terms of physical benefits. When we help others, we often experience what has been called the helper's high, as endorphins are released in our brain, leading to a euphoric state. The same reward centers of the brain seem to light up when we're doing something compassionate as when we think of chocolate. So it doesn't mean you should just think of chocolate instead of being compassionate. Maybe that would be the wrong message to take away from that. Just because Lama Yeshe has a book that's called When the Chocolate Runs Out, because at some point you aren't going to have the chocolate, right? So then you have to be forced to be compassionate to get your high. But this is true. Many of us know this helper's high. He says the warm feeling we get from helping others comes from the release of oxytocin, the same hormone that is released by lactating mothers. Once more, we're back to the mother thing, that bond between mother and child. This hormone seems to have health benefits, including the reduction of inflammation in the cardiovascular system. Compassion literally makes our heart healthy and happy. So, I guess they put a lot of this in there because if they haven't sold you on compassion for the mental benefits, then you can sign up for the good physical effects. A last point on compassion is that it's, in terms of the benefits, is that it is contagious. We were talking about gratitude being contagious as well, but compassion, when we see others being compassionate, we are more likely to be compassionate. This results in a feeling called moral elevation. And yesterday, when I went through these various aspects of joy, that was our starting point, that Paul Ekman, the researcher, had put together, his research of emotions. On that list was elevation, which is this idea of having witnessed an act of kindness, generosity, or compassion. We feel elevated. We feel a sense of joy. I mentioned the video that I saw on CNN of a little 4-year-old boy that's taking meals to homeless guys on the streets of Houston. I mean, any of these things that we're witness to, they elevate ourselves in a sense of joyful connection with others. And that's the power of compassion. When we see others doing it, that we feel a sense of, I need to do this as well. I need to find my way to contribute to the well-being of others. It may not look like what others are doing, but it's contagious in its own way then. Recent research by social scientists Nicholas Christakis and James Fowler suggests that this ripple effect can extend out to 2 and 3 degrees of separation. In other words, experiments with large numbers of people show that if you are kind and compassionate, your friends, and even your friends' friends are more likely to be more kind and compassionate. So this is what I was mentioning earlier, that compassion doesn't just have an effect on our own little bubble. It has a bearing on the whole world that we live in. Because if these friends are engaging in it, then it's also their friends and their friends' friends and their friends' friends. And then if the friends' friends are engaging in it, then you see what I mean. It's like it keeps moving by virtue of I don't know, we had that idea some years ago that's still very active, of pay it forward, of just always extending kindness and compassion to others, because we see that it does have that effect on others. Let's go on to the topic of, that was the benefits of compassion. Let's talk about the obstacles to compassion. We fear compassion because we're afraid of experiencing the suffering, the vulnerability, and the helplessness that can come with having an open heart. And this is very true. I mean, this is part of why compassion is so powerful. Frequently we talk about, in the Buddhist tradition, compassion and love, or loving kindness. These two are kind of focused on the state of sentient beings. Compassion is observing their suffering and wanting them to be free from that, wanting to help them to be free from that. Whereas love, loving kindness as it's sometimes called, is observing sentient beings and wanting them to be happy, wanting them to have all the causes of happiness, and to be about, helping them to do that. So there's a difference in the quality of these two emotions. They're very much practiced in tandem. We first look at sentient beings and have a wish for them to be happy or a wish for them to be free from suffering, but we alternate between those two, and they both have different perspectives. This is, I think, why compassion is so powerful, and why frequently we talk about the root of our path being compassion. Because we have to experience that suffering and that vulnerability to really experience compassion deeply. If we're going to genuinely put ourselves in a space of identifying with the other and being in the shoes of another, we have to know our own vulnerability and be okay with our own vulnerability. And this is part of the condition of life, right? That we are all vulnerable. I was talking earlier about death and the uncertainty of the time of our death. That's a vulnerability we live with all the time. We don't like to think about it because it's not maybe the most pleasant thing to think about, but it can help us to identify and connect with the suffering of others. That when we see others suffering, our own vulnerability is a doorway through which we can be with them in their vulnerability. So psychologist Paul Gilbert, many of you have heard of him. He's done a number of books on compassion that through his research, he's found that many people are afraid that if they are compassionate, they will be taken advantage of, that others will become dependent on them, and that they won't be able to handle others' distress. We know that these fears come with being compassionate. And that's why if you have never done kind of work where you are helping another in a very direct way, some of these fears may come up. You're kind of putting yourself out there. Will this cause me to be taken advantage of? Will I have the strength to be able to be with others in their distress? Sometimes with some others, we might have a fear that they become dependent on us. So we have to be able to set those fears aside to kind of overcome these obstacles. So some continued advice on this. It says one of the differences between empathy and compassion is that while empathy is simply experiencing another's emotion, compassion is a more empowered state where we want what is best for the person. Kind of says, okay, empathy is necessary. I have to have an empathic connection with that being. But then I have to go beyond that, not just feeling that emotion, but saying, I want what's best for you, for you to be relieved of that, for you to not have that continue. So it's a more empowered state, definitely. As the Dalai Lama described it, if we see a person who is being crushed by a rock, the goal is not to get under the rock and feel what they are feeling. It is to help remove the rock, right? I mean, this makes sense in this analogy. Yes, it's good to have the empathy initially. It says, oh my God, that must be horrible for you to be under that rock. And then you remove the rock. You don't say, oh, well, let me go feel what that's like so I make sure that I know what you're feeling, I like that one. That's cute. Once more, we see how humor, one of our 8 pillars, plays a role with these amazing teachers. So many people are also afraid of receiving compassion from others because they are afraid that others will want something in return or that they will at least feel indebted. So this is on the receiving end. We're giving compassion to others and genuinely wanting them to not suffer. But sometimes we don't even want others' compassion for us. Kind of like, no, I'm okay, just let me be. Because we fear that, they're going to want something from us, or we're kind of indebted to them now. So finally, many people are even afraid of being self-compassionate, which is the last topic we'll talk about on compassion. Because they are afraid they will become weak, that they will not work as hard, or that they will be overcome with sadness and grief. There's been a lot of attention on self-compassion. That's why I do want to spend a little time talking about it today in Buddhist circles, but also in psychology circles, and the necessity for really accentuating that state of mind. And self-compassion is different than self-centeredness. It is a genuine response to one's own situation and an embracing of that as I'm a suffering being, and I don't want to continue to suffer in these ways. But to really understand all the components of it and the commonness of that, to be able to then channel that into compassion for others. It doesn't stop at just like a me, myself, and I and my problems. But I can imagine some people will have great fears around even being self-compassionate for these reasons. So Paul Gilbert, who was cited before, says, compassion can flow naturally when we understand and work to remove our fears, our blocks, and our resistances to it. Compassion is one of the most difficult and courageous of all our motivations, but it is also the most healing and elevating. I don't know. All of the great spiritual teachers we have in the world have all, propounded the amazing power of compassion, have done acts out of their compassion. And I grew up Catholic, and, Christ was always presented to me as somebody, again, who, through his compassion, was taking on the sins of the world and being crucified for the benefit of all beings. The Buddha himself is said to have taught everything he taught out of compassion. It would have been very easy just to say, okay, I've realized this state, bye everyone, hope you figure it out, and he didn't. He said, no, I have to continue the work of benefiting others from that place of wisdom. So it's very powerful. We need to kind of get through these obstacles, kind of understand them, understand the mechanism of them. We don't have time to go into all of that today, but self-compassion. Self-compassion is closely connected to self-acceptance, but it is even more than the acceptance of ourselves. It is actually having compassion for our human frailties, recognizing that we are vulnerable and limited like all people. In the teachings that I mentioned, this course that I do, the Art of Fulfillment, where we go into balanced empathy, the beginning, the very first session, we talk about our own vulnerabilities. Really get in touch with ourselves as vulnerable beings. In the second session, we begin to identify the vulnerability of others and feel that connection to others from that space of a common experience, a shared experience. Then we can extend it to a real empathy, because we have seen how we are the same as others. I would say, a lot of the students I've encountered, maybe even a majority of them, have found it harder to have compassion for themselves than for others. And it's really kind of sad in our culture that this is the case. As a result, it is a fundamental basis, for developing compassion for others, acknowledging our own vulnerability. It's hard to love others as you love yourself, as both men pointed out, if you don't love yourself. How can you say you're going to love others as yourself, this very common teaching in Christianity, if you don't love yourself, if you really don't know what it means to love yourself, to have compassion for yourself? So, I don't know that I need to cover that one. So, based on modern times, sometimes people are not very compassionate with themselves. People don't rest when they are tired. They neglect their basic needs for sleep, food, and exercise as they drive themselves harder and harder. As the Dalai Lama said, they treat themselves as if they were part of the machine. Thupten Jinpa, who again is His Holiness's translator, explains, lack of self-compassion manifests in a harsh and judgmental relationship with ourselves. Many people believe that unless they are critical and demanding, they will be failures, unworthy of recognition and undeserving of love. I mean, it's, again, sad how prevalent this message is, and many of us got it when we were quite young from parents, from others in our lives, and we bought into it and think that this is how we actually create the causes for our success, is by being extremely harsh on ourselves. They often point out, Kristen Neff, who's going to be cited in the next slide, she's written a book called Self-Compassion and has a website with some wonderful information on this, working with this idea. She says that if you really examine the way that you talk to yourself when you're being self-critical, and then think, would you say that to your best friend when they're going through something difficult or doing something, that they're not supposed to do or isn't good for them to do? We know that we would never talk to others in the way we talk to ourselves, that we have an inner voice that is really very critical, very harsh. So that's a good checkup. And maybe some of you are fine. Maybe you say, actually, no, I treat myself really quite kindly and I treat others the same way. That's great. You've achieved that. But I would say most of us probably have a struggle yet with having a real compassionate voice towards ourselves. So how can we genuinely have that for others if we're really not practicing it with ourselves, if we're really not taking care of ourselves? So Kristen Neff, who I mentioned, has identified ways to express self-compassion. When we treat ourselves with compassion, we accept that there are parts of our personality that we may not be satisfied with, but we don't berate ourselves as we try to address them. That's the total wrong approach. If we really want to encourage growth, think about children, because sometimes our minds are like children. They're just like this child we need to attend to. So if we really think about a young child, you don't get them to do much to improve their abilities and qualities by berating them about what they can't do, right? You find gentle ways to nurture and accept that there is room for improvement, that they can do things better, and you help them along in a very kind and gentle way. When we go through a difficult time, we are caring and kind to ourselves as we would be to a friend or relative. When we feel inadequate in some way, we remind ourselves that all people have these feelings or limitations. So this is how we practice genuine self-compassion. Talk to ourselves as if we were somebody else that we're trying to help through a difficult time. Remind ourselves of our own inadequacies or vulnerability and what have you, that it's no different than what others experience. When things are hard, we recognize that all people go through similar challenges. And finally, when we are feeling down, we try to understand this feeling with curiosity and acceptance rather than rejection or self-judgment. And Buddhist practices do help to some degree in this. When we are able to be somewhat more mindful and present with what's going on in our minds, we don't identify so much with all of these thought patterns. That when there is a tendency to see, self-criticism coming through, that isn't, we don't need to buy into that. These are just thoughts, things going through the sky of our minds. And it's important to just be kind of curious about these, when we're feeling down, when we're feeling depressed. Not to think that we have to totally identify with that state of mind. We're so much more than that, kind of pulled back into the spaciousness of the sky rather than getting totally caught up in that particular dark cloud. So all of these things can be managed in conjunction with Buddhist practice of meditation and so on. So that kind of brings me to the concluding thoughts on compassion, but let me check in. I've gone through a lot of these topics. Any comments on obstacles to compassion, self-compassion, benefits of compassion, compassion? Good stuff, okay. I mean, I hope this is always, I'm always hoping everything I do is helpful. For this course, I feel like I'm drawing a lot sometimes from the book, but there's such good stuff in here. And I just want it always to be a springboard for us to explore these ideas. And so anything you have to share is always welcome as we go through our last little half hour or so. So let's wrap up compassion. The Archbishop and the Dalai Lama had revealed throughout the week one of the core paradoxes of happiness. We are most joyful when we focus on others, not on ourselves. In short, bringing joy to others is the fastest way to experience joy oneself. As the Dalai Lama had said, even 10 minutes of meditation on the well-being of others can help one to feel joyful for the whole day, even before coffee. When we close our heart, we cannot be joyful. When we have the courage to live with an open heart, we are able to feel our pain and the pain of others, but we are also able to experience more joy. The bigger and warmer our heart, the stronger our sense of aliveness and resilience. And of course, this open-heartedness extends out into the last pillar that we're going to talk about, generosity. So the practice suggestions that are on the sheet that you have, did everybody get a sheet when you came in? Yeah, okay. Is first to reflect on your own capacity for practicing compassion, whatever that might be. Again, this is a way, frequently we encourage people to do this practice, a bit of rejoicing, but to really look at the qualities you already have as a way of helping you to get in touch with your own ability to practice in that way. You all have compassion, without a doubt. I know every being, every one of you has compassion. Every being in this world, has some measure of compassion that they've experienced. So whatever level of compassion you practice, rejoice in your ability to open to your own suffering and the suffering of the world. Even if this point it's mostly self-compassion or just compassion for the people that are really close to you in this life or the pets that you have or whatever, know that that in and of itself is the same seed of compassion we're talking about developing. So rejoicing is a way of feeling good about what you do have, having a joyful mind about that, and letting that feed this process of developing more compassion. And then Dalai Lama's advice that we just went through to meditate on compassion and concern for others' well-being 10 minutes a day, and just see what effect it brings. And by the way, all these different practice advice, I don't encourage you to do all 10 or all 8 of them like, today or something or tomorrow. See what appeals to you most out of all of these, the ones that we've gone through. And then begin there. And then you'll always have these to look back on and to, decide you want to pursue some of these further. So when it says meditated on for 10 minutes a day, what he's meaning is to actually do a bit of what we call analytical meditation. So maybe, you first still the mind a little bit by focusing on the breath like we did at the beginning of today. That was earlier today. And then on the basis of some meditation on the breath, introduce the idea of thinking about the welfare of others. And that may mean thinking about others who perhaps on the news you saw, what's in a lot of our awareness these days are the suffering that's happening with immigrant families who are being separated. And so we can think about what that's like for the children who are in that situation. Think about our concern for their well-being. Maybe, again, whatever compassion we can muster up for that, for, really wanting them to be free from suffering, wanting to be able to help them to be free from suffering. Do whatever practice works for you, whatever object of compassion works for you. But the main thoughts are your compassion that wants others to not suffer, and your compassion that wants to kind of help others to be free from that. And you might even need to meditate on self-compassion first. That's fine. If you feel like that's a more productive use of your 10 minutes a day to generate those thoughts towards yourself, by all means do that. As I said, most of us do still struggle with self-compassion. So if there's no other questions or comments, let's go on to generosity. See if I can get through this. The little cartoon I choose for this was kind of cute when it showed like the circle of generosity. So I don't know if you can see everything, but there's up here at like 2 o'clock, there's a man that's giving a flower to the woman down here, and she's pouring tea for the woman over there who's doing dishes, and handing a present to the man who's up there, and the man up there is handing a cup of coffee to the guy who's holding the door open for the man who came in with the flower. So it's a bit like, this is the circle of generosity, that kind of, again, a bit of a pay it forward idea that if we always are being generous to others and kind to others, it does frequently create that circle of generosity, others being willing to give to others on the basis of our kindness. So in the book it says, I think that almost all of us are surprised how our joy is enhanced when we make someone else happy. Maybe we aren't that surprised, I don't know. Hopefully we are doing it often enough where we see that is often the case. I think every one of us have this experience, right? When you've done something really good for another person, and sometimes it may just be, giving them a nice gift or just acknowledging something about them that makes them feel good. This can give us happiness too, right? Our own generosity of giving in whatever way, giving compliments, giving material things. And he uses this example about his wife. This is Douglas Adams' wife, Rachel. He says, you go to town, you've gone to do some shopping, and when you get back home, you have a bunch of flowers for Rachel. She wasn't expecting them, and the glow of her face and the joy that comes from having made another person joyful is something that you can't actually compute. So the Archbishop said with a laugh, our book, meaning the Bible, for him, says that it is in giving that we receive, right? This is from even the prayer of St. Francis, that we include that it is in giving that we receive. So I would hope that people would recognize in themselves that it is when we are closed in on ourselves that we tend to be miserable. It is when we grow in a self-forgetfulness in a remarkable way, we discover that we are filled with joy. So I think we all know this, right? That when there's a generosity to our being, that this is actually a very joyful state to be in. And when we're kind of closed down and being tight and miserly in our own ways, that joy gets kind of squelched. I've sometimes joked, the Archbishop says, and said, God doesn't know very much, because when you give to others, it should be that you are subtracting from yourself. But in this incredible kind of way, I've certainly found that to be the case so many times. You gave, and it then seems that in fact you are making space to be given to you. Of course, in Buddhism, we hold that to be kind of what happens karmically. But it's not even just, again, the karma that happens way down the road, but you are given even in the moment. That lightness, that joy that is a part of pleasing another through giving to them, through being generous. And there is a very physical example, the Archbishop says. The Dead Sea in the Middle East receives fresh water, so there's fresh water coming into it from various places, but it has no outlet, so it doesn't pass the water out. It receives beautiful water from the rivers, and the water goes dank. It just goes bad. And that's why it is the Dead Sea. It receives and does not give. So we can maybe use it as an analogy for how we don't want to be, to be like the Dead Sea. All this great stuff coming in from all around us, and us just kind of not doing anything to keep it circulating, keep moving that energy of generosity, of kindness. And we are made much that way too, he says. We receive and we must give. In the end, generosity is the best way of becoming more, and more joyful. So, in the book it says we had come to the 8th and final pillar of joy, which is generosity. Generosity, he says, is often a natural outgrowth of compassion, though the line between the two can be hard to distinguish. As Thupten Jinpa pointed out, we don't need to wait until the feelings of compassion arise before we choose to be generous. Generosity is often something that we learn to enjoy by doing. In fact, in one of the great Kadampa masters of Tibetan Buddhism encouraged you to practice generosity by taking something that you own and putting it in one hand and giving it to the other hand. Oh, thank you. Then you go, oh, thank you. It sounds kind of simplistic. Maybe you teach a child to practice generosity that way. But you start with what's simple, and maybe once more, I'm a big proponent, and Tibetan Buddhism is, of fake it till you make it. You just try to practice being generous, practice being kind in whatever way works for you. I mean, one of the ways that we get most frequently challenged in terms of material generosity, at least in cities and almost every city of this country, is through the homeless situation. And so many people who are in that position of needing the generosity of others to have the food that they eat, to be able to take care of themselves. And so it's frequently a question about how to manage all of that and how to work with all of that. I've never traveled to India myself, but I've heard of people who've gone on pilgrimages there, and there they say it's even more difficult because there's just so many people that want money from you and that come up to you with that request, and it's very hard to kind of sort it all out and to make sure you're doing what's right by giving. But you start with whatever's comfortable for you. Some people like to just go down there with bits of food or something, maybe some wrapped food that they can hand out to people happily. Other people are quite fine with giving money, but to not stop where we can, or where we think, just not pushing ourselves beyond that comfort zone, but to always be looking at how can I be more and more generous. Again, I know there's lots of dynamics around the homeless situation that make it more complicated because we don't always know what people do with the resources we give them. That's why sometimes people will go down and give food rather than giving money that could be abused by some people. But nonetheless, I think we all have to find our way of being attentive to those in our society who do need, do have resource needs. So we have to learn to enjoy it by doing it. So the text goes on and says, it is probably for this reason that charity is prescribed by almost every religious tradition. It is one of the 5 pillars of Islam, called zakat. In Judaism, it is called tzedakah, which literally means justice. In Hinduism and Buddhism, it is called dana. And in Christianity, it is charity. So we know that this is a real foundational practice in spiritual traditions, but also in society at large. That generosity is kind of assumed that it will be a part of a good culture, where people have the opportunity to give. Sometimes, it's giving to institutions, organizations, agencies that help others. Sometimes it's giving directly to the people who need. But and I'm mostly talking about material generosity, but obviously there are other ways that we can be generous, and we'll go into that. So the topics I want to touch on, we got about 15 minutes. We'll see how we do. 5 minutes or 3 minutes for each of these topics. The benefits of generosity, various ways of giving, obstacles, the need for a new mentality. This kind of came up in this section. It's kind of moving into a bit of more of an overview of everything we've looked at. And then what we might lastly call the generosity of the spirit. Generosity is so important in all the world's religions, because it no doubt expresses a fundamental aspect of our interdependence and our need for one another. It was so important for our survival that the reward centers of our brain light up as strongly when we give as when we receive, sometimes even more so. I even find this myself, that I get much greater pleasure out of giving to others than receiving. It feels good to do that. It feels good to be in that space of giving. So we know that this is kind of a part of our existence, a part of our being. It's important part of our interdependence, the fact that we do need each other, that nobody lives independently. Researcher Elizabeth Dunn, I don't know much about her, but she's mentioned in the book, and she has various colleagues that found that people experience greater happiness when they spend money on others than when they spend it on themselves. Also found that older adults with hypertension have decreased blood pressure when they are assigned to spend money on others rather than themselves. But I frequently find it a lot more fun to go out shopping for something for someone else than to go shopping for myself. Though there are challenges to that too. Of course, we get into the whole thing that our culture around Christmas and all these holidays where we feel like we have to find the perfect gift or something, that becomes a whole nother level of pressure. But if you're just out, and traveling here and there, and there's some delight in kind of saying, oh, what could I what would bring some delight to that person back home, or what would, it's just kind of nice to be in that space. We see that it does give us that liberation from our own self-centeredness and our focus on others. As the Archbishop had explained, we receive when we give. And so then there was a little story, I'm not going to share that because of the time, about someone he knew who decided he was going to give all this money before the huge market crash in 2008, all of what happened there. And he had made the promise to give this money to a charity. And many of his colleagues said, no, you shouldn't be doing that because you don't have that much money now that the market's crashed. And he made the decision that he had to. He knew that was an important thing to do. And so he went ahead and gave it, and his explanation was something like, that's the only reason why I have all these resources is to be able to give them. So it's really nice when we see people who are that wealthy doing that. Some people even ask karmically, well, okay, that person's wealthy because they must have been generous in the past. So why aren't all wealthy people generous? And that's because karma is quite complex. It's not like everything ripens at the same time, that we're sort of cast in stone, that once we're generous for a bit, that then we're always going to be generous. Because we have the seeds of miserliness as well, the seeds that keep us from being generous. So we can never tell when these things are kind of going to ripen, or when causes and conditions might influence us to be different. So generosity in terms of the various ways of giving, this is the next topic. It's not just about the money we give. I've been talking mostly in terms of resources or money. It's also about how we give our time. In the happiness literature, there's a great deal of research on the importance of having a sense of purpose. Purpose fundamentally is about how we are able to contribute and be generous to others, how we feel needed by and of value to others. So this is kind of an interesting point, that we do tend to think of generosity in terms of just money and physical resources. But time is really an important part of that. And when we make decisions about where we give our time, it is good to be guided to some degree by where we feel there's great value to our time. Where we will be able to contribute to what we have that conviction is part of our deeper purpose, part of why we want to be in the world. I mentioned, I think the other day, this idea of this organization called End World Hunger Now. There was a woman named Lynn Twist. She's written a lot on money and kind of how to work with money, and does workshops. I think her book is called The Soul of Money. She's even renowned for having turned down like a $500,000 donation from somebody because she felt it wasn't coming from the right place mentally. She just felt like there was something tainted about the money in terms of the way that person was wanting to make the offering. So anyway, the point I was going to make about her in regard to this? Sorry, I lost my train of thought. About purpose, yeah. Anyway, I can't remember all of what I was going to say in regard to that. Thanks for that. Helping me, but I don't know, my mind's not thinking right now in terms of what I was going to say about her. It'll come back to me perhaps. So having a purpose, kind of figuring out what is the way that we want to contribute to the world. In terms of our time, I think it's really important that we make some decisions that complement that. I think, and many of you in the room are quite involved in giving your time and energy to the center here, for example. And this is a decision you're making because you do feel that it is related to your purpose, related to how you want to contribute to this world. We have so many opportunities to do this. Almost more than what we could possibly ever contemplate doing. But each of us has to determine what is the best way for me to contribute to the world. But that does help us to give credence to our own purpose then as well. It kind of helps feed that if we feel that we're more deeply connected to things because we are motivated by that particular thing, such as the center here or what have you, then we feel very good about what we're doing, and it helps us to have a greater connection to others through that. The next slide kind of points to some of this too. It was just coming back to me a bit about Lynn Twist because I was talking about the End World Hunger Now. Oh, it's gone. Sorry. I apologize. I sometimes lose my train of thought, and it doesn't happen that often. But In a study conducted by neuropsychologist Patricia Boyle and colleagues and reported in the Journal of American Medicine Association or something, JAMA, I can't remember what it all stands for, psychiatry, people with a sense of purpose were half as likely to develop Alzheimer's disease after 7 years. It's no surprise then that being generous with our time seems to be equally profound for our health. You know, as I said, this is where we can contribute to the world in terms of the time that we do have. And maybe many of us don't have tons of time to give to other purposes, other causes. But find what works for you. Find what helps you to complement your own sense of purpose, your own desire to contribute to the world. This is an amazing way to give, and it doesn't require anything but our time. It doesn't require, writing a check and all the other things that might be involved in other generosity. Compassion and generosity are not just lofty virtues, they are at the center of our humanity, what makes our lives joyful and meaningful. Yes, there are many, many, many ugly things, the Archbishop explained, but there are also some incredibly beautiful things in our world. The black townships in South Africa, he says, are squalor-ridden, and because of despair and disease, including HIV, children are orphaned. In one of the townships, I met a mother who had collected these abandoned children off the streets. She's got nothing much in the way of resources, but the minute she began doing that, help began coming for her to carry out her work of compassion. So he talks a bit more about that in the book. I don't have the time to go into that. But this was like her deciding, just like this 4-year-old boy in Houston who decided he was going to start taking sandwiches to the homeless guys on the street, or homeless people on the street. This is a woman who saw that in her own neighborhood were these orphan children, and she wasn't going to let them live out on the streets. She was going to do something about it, and she had no resources, or very little resources to begin with. She just started opening her door, and everything followed. The energy kind of collected around her by virtue of her compassion. And he says, and you are surprised, the Archbishop continued, when you go to a monastery or a convent where people live a very, very simple life, and you just have to accept that they have a peace that we who are always grabbing find elusive. Unless, of course, we sit loosely in relation to all of our wealth and all of our status, then we can be generous because we have really been made a steward of these possessions and these positions, and we don't hold on to them for dear life. So this is kind of an ideal way to see, like we are just stewards of the resources we have, the money in our bank accounts, the possessions that, we collect. And it is our job to try to use those in the best way. Even our own position, our own abilities. We are just the receptacle, the carrier of all of that. And it's our job to make sure that we utilize them well. So it's not the wealth and the status, he says. These are neutral. It's our attitude. It's what we do with them that is so important. We said it on the very first day. When you become so inward-looking, so self-regarding, you're going to end up a shriveled human being. There are ways to give even beyond our time and our money. Thupten Jinpa explained that in Buddhist teachings there are 3 kinds of generosity. Material giving, giving from freedom from fear, which can involve protection, counseling, or solace, and spiritual giving, which can involve giving your wisdom, moral and ethical teachings, and helping people to be more self-sufficient and happier. And of course, this is what these 2 beings do all the time. So let me go through each of these, because these are what I would encourage you to look at how you might practice generosity. It's part of the practice advice. Material giving, there's no substitute for helping to lessen the inequality and injustice that are such enduring features of our world. Whether you tithe or give dana, this is really the beginning of weekly and even daily practice of thinking about how you can give to others. Again, not everybody has material resources to give, so that's why there are other ways of giving. Giving freedom from fear. This can involve giving protection, counsel, or solace. This is how we give our time and attention to others. Who needs your presence today? Do your children, your spouse, your parents, your colleagues, your friends, or even the stranger on the street need your compassion and your caring? To whom can you reach out to support? So this is an important part of our practice, is to, and I like Alex Berzin, another Tibetan Buddhist teacher, when he was teaching on this idea of giving freedom from fear. He says, even our presence in the world as beings who are not intent on harming others, who are in touch with our spirit of loving kindness and compassion, this is giving protection to others. Look at how many people in the world are, coming from a place of their fear and insecurity. If we come from a place of open-heartedness and generosity of ourselves to others, this is an amazing gift to others. To be with others in a space of not inducing any fear in them, not causing them to, have suspicions about us or have, some sense of danger. The final one, spiritual giving. I love how they point this out. You don't have to be a holy man or a spiritual teacher to give in this way. You don't have to be the Dalai Lama or the Archbishop. Spiritual giving can involve giving wisdom and teachings to those who may need them. Now again, not force-feeding them. We're not into proselytizing in Buddhism. We don't go door to door and try to shove Buddhism down people's throats or anything. We just acknowledge that if you have teachings you have had, that includes anything you've heard this weekend or any other teacher that has come through here or any book you've read. If you hear somebody in your life say that something's going on for them and you think it may be an applicable teaching, ask them if they would like to hear that. Say, I have some ideas from something I read or something I heard at a teaching that I'd like to share with you that I think might be helpful, but would you like to hear that, And then if the person says yes, then you can share that with them. And maybe they haven't really thought about a different perspective or a different way of looking at things, or thought about, how to get in touch with these qualities in their own heart. And that might be really wonderful. You can help them in that way. I'm going to pass over obstacles to generosity, because I think we kind of know these, that we do have a lot of things that hold us back from practicing generosity. So this is where I want to end up. Next one. This next topic, which is the need for a new mentality. And a question is asked of the Dalai Lama and the Archbishop from Micah in South Africa. She asks, how can you be of service to people, nature, and causes in need without losing yourself completely to a crisis mentality? How can we help the world heal and still find joy in our lives? The Dalai Lama goes on, he doesn't quite answer the question, but he talks about something really wonderful. He says, okay, now I am always sharing with people that the problems we are facing today are very difficult to solve. An entire generation has been brought up with a certain mentality, with a certain way of life. So when we think about the future, how to build healthy humanity, we really have to think about how we create a new generation of citizens with a different kind of mindset. Here, education really is the key. Christianity has wonderful teachings, so does Buddhism, but these teachings and approaches are not sufficient. Now, secular education, which is one of his big aims, this is why a lot of what I try to do is around secular ideas, concepts, bringing, wisdom that doesn't just come from spiritual traditions, but comes from our own shared experience as human beings. That this secular education is universal. So now we must include informal education of our youth, some teaching of compassion and basic ethics, not on the basis of religious belief, but on the basis of scientific findings and our common sense and our universal experience. Just complaining about the present situation is not much help. So he's just really encouraging us to kind of sign up for this idea that we could create a new mentality out of being attentive to what needs to happen in terms of educating people to be global citizens, to be universally concerned and responsible. He says it's very difficult to deal with our current world crises because of our basic mentality. As you mentioned, this is to the Archbishop. His father was usually a very good man, but when he was drunk, he behaved badly. Today, I think many human beings are drunk. They have too many negative emotions like greed, fear, and anger dominating their minds, so they act like drunk people, kind of intoxicated with our own delusions. The only way out of this drunken stupor is to educate children about the value of compassion and the value of applying our mind. We need a long-term approach rooted in a vision to address our collective global challenges. This would require a fundamental shift in human consciousness, something only education is best suited to achieve. This is a theme I come back to frequently in some of the stuff I've done here this week, but up in San Francisco as well, that we need to have a shift in human awareness and consciousness that Buddhism can contribute to, Christianity, all the other traditions can contribute to, but we need moreover a universal ethics, a secular education that will help bring people to that. So he says time never waits, so I think it is very important that we start now. then maybe the new generation will be in a position to solve these global problems in their lifetime. We, the elder generation, have created a lot of problems in the 20th century. The generations of the 21st century will have to find the solutions for them. He's not kind of passing the buck to them and saying, we're not going to be involved. But nonetheless, our time, this isn't our time. This isn't, the time for a lot of us who've been here for a number of years to be involved in that. We do have to admit our culpability in it and do what we can to curtail the behavior that leads in that direction. But it will be others. And then it goes back to this idea once more that the Archbishop says, people are fundamentally compassionate. And the Dalai Lama jumped in. Yes, that is the basis of our hope. Even the most selfish person must have a modicum of compassion for his family. So we're not speaking about something alien. We're saying that we've discovered that we are interdependent. And so now Douglas Adams went back to Micah's question, which His Holiness didn't quite answer. As I said, wonderful stuff to talk about secular education, but how do we keep our spirit, our desire to continue to do the work in the midst of a very complex and difficult world? And the Archbishop said, as an old man, I can say, start where you are and realize that you are not meant on your own to resolve all of these massive problems. Do what you can. It seems so obvious. And you will be surprised, actually, at how it can get to be catching. Hey, remember, you are not alone, and you do not need to finish the work. It takes time, but we are learning, we are growing, we are becoming the people we want to be. It helps no one if you sacrifice your joy because others are suffering. This is moving us into the final topic today, which is generosity of the spirit. We people who care must be attractive, must be filled with joy, so that others recognize that caring, that helping, and being generous are not a burden, they are a joy. Give the world your love, your service, your healing, but you can also give it your joy. This too is a great gift. And I guess if I go back to, when I started this whole weekend, we were talking about joy and the need to develop this, but it's so that we can then share that joy with others, so we can be a source of that and a reflection of that for others. That's the power of joy, is that it is an amazing gift to the world to live from that space of joy through practicing these 8 pillars. So the Archbishop and the Dalai Lama were describing a special kind of generosity, the generosity of the spirit. The quality they both have, perhaps more than any other, is this generosity of the spirit. They are big-hearted, magnanimous, tolerant, broad-minded, patient, forgiving, and kind. Maybe this generosity of the spirit is the truest expression of spiritual development, of what the Archbishop had said it takes time to become. And the Archbishop uses this phrase about that. He says, become an oasis of peace, a pool of serenity that ripples out to all those around us. So this is the idea. Again, I'm going to skip over a few of these to this slide that talks about what we mean then as another component of this third type of giving, spiritual giving. It can also involve helping others to be more joyful through the generosity of your own spirit. Seek to be that oasis of caring and concern as you live your life. Simply smiling at others as you walk down the street can make an enormous difference in the quality of human interaction in your community. So this is a form of generosity, to be generosity with our very being, with our spirit. And it is in this interaction, and it is this interaction that is most responsible for the quality of human life on our increasingly crowded and lonely planet, our affluent and still impoverished world. So then there's a few slides. Again, if you get these slides, you can read those perhaps, but we see that all of these can be related. But in the final thought, as the Dalai Lama put it, in fact, taking care of others, helping others, ultimately is the way to discover your own joy and to have a happy life. So, to conclude, the practice suggestions on generosity, I touched on already, this idea of the 3 types of generosity in that second suggestion. The first suggestion, reflect on and rejoice in all the various ways that you give to others. This is in the same line of the compassion advice, that we have to actually acknowledge that we are generous beings in our own way. And start there. Start by rejoicing in that and really acknowledging that, and then extend it out from there. So any comments or questions on this? Sorry for not having the time to go through all of it, but I actually did all right for 408, and I didn't skip too many slides. So I'm saying thank you, but we obviously, I'm very grateful for these two amazing teachers who wrote this book and gave this advice. I would encourage you certainly to read the book if you feel inclined. Really has a lot more than what I've been able to talk about, but nonetheless, I hope this exploration of these ideas, especially these 8 pillars, has been useful to see that, there are many things we can do. I don't think these are the only pillars of joy. These are 8 that we can start with, that we can work with. And hopefully we can be contagious with our joy, help that joy to spread in the world, and for each of us to be of great benefit to others. So let's have those kind of concluding thoughts for today, what we call our thoughts of dedication. So dedicate for the well-being of all sentient beings, the joy of all beings, the idea that we do have the potential, every one of us, to get to that state of unparalleled joy and bliss, the state of Buddhahood. And think that through the power of what we've done here today, over this weekend, that this becomes the cause, without doubt, for that result, that we can envision that actually happening, our own enlightenment, to be able to contribute to the enlightenment of all beings attaining that state, complete freedom from suffering, complete joy and bliss of enlightenment. And then dedicate for the good health and long life, as we've been doing, of these 2 amazing beings, His Holiness the Dalai Lama, Archbishop Desmond Tutu, also for all of the spiritual guides that we have a karmic connection with, as well as that others have a connection with. And think that through our efforts here this weekend, we've created the cause for them to have good health, for them to have long lives, and for us and others to never be parted from perfect guides. And then finally, extend this out to others with that spirit of compassion and generosity, and even gratitude, recognizing that there are many beings we know of in our lives who are suffering right now in more noticeable ways, might be experiencing obstacles or illness. Perhaps we know some who are dying or who have died. Send this positive energy out gladly. Share this merit with them. And think that through the force of what we've done, it becomes the cause for them to be free of their suffering, and for them to experience everything that brings them happiness and well-being and true joy. And may all beings know that true joy through our efforts here this weekend. Thank you all very much. Really, seriously, it was wonderful to share this with you. So I appreciate the opportunity. Okay.